Thanks for joining us. I'm Pam Goins, Executive Director of NASCA. We are so excited to be with you all today. And first, let me just say thank you to this group who are our sponsors and our supporters of our Winter Thought Leadership Series. We wouldn't be able to do this without you. You hear me say that all the time, but that is genuinely an accurate statement. If it weren't for you wanting to engage with our members, we wouldn't be able to produce what we hope are world-class events for all of our members here at NASCA. So thank you. We do want to have this opportunity today to just share. This is going to be incredibly intimate, conversational, very much a two-way conversation, and a sneak peek, if you will, at the top priorities for our state chief administrators. We've taken a long process to get here through specific events with our chiefs, through our Winter Thought Leadership Series, development with our Research and Policy Committee, and you're going to hear a little bit about that as we go throughout the afternoon. But we're excited to share this with you. Will not be officially released for another, almost 11, 12 days now. So again, this is a sneak peek for you to really hear what the states are focusing on in 2021. Let me also just quickly pause and say, we know that yesterday was what I'll call a sad day for our country, and one that I did not expect to see in my lifetime. No matter which side of the aisle that you're on, I think it was a challenging day for all of us. It's a challenging day for our states, for our state capitals, for our federal government, for our administration. So we're wrapping our arms around all of our states. We're wrapping our arms around all of our corporate partners. We know it's tough for you all as well. So again, thank you for your time. Thank you for being with us. I'm going to kick it off to our program chair, who has led us, guided us, really brought us through all of these wonderful professional development opportunities that we've done with the last few months. Cara Veach from Colorado.
Thanks, Pam. Yes, I think we would be remiss if we didn't just take a minute to think about what happened yesterday, what it means to be public servants, but also what it means for you and how you serve the public through us and helping us deliver services as part of that critical role the government portrays. So it was a hard day for lots of us yesterday and a little bit this morning as well. Thank you to our winter sponsors. Pam said it, we couldn't have done this without you, not just this time, but every time. And one of the things that makes NASCA such a rewarding organization to belong to is our ability to connect with our vendors in a smaller, intimate setting. It's not one state to 30 vendors, but really that opportunity to connect and understand, what are you doing out there? What are the great things you're learning? And then all those spin-off conversations that we have to say, hey, I have this problem. How can you help me? What are you doing? So in October of 2020, which seems like forever ago, as part of our Winter Thought Leadership Series, as we have done in the past, we have a session that is called a state roll call. And it's just the chief administrators. It's like one of the few things we do that's just chief administrators. And we talk about our challenges that are facing us. And sometimes it's like, oh my God, my governor is making me crazy. Here's why. But it could also be COVID. And so, but we also feel it's important that you understand what those things were. So we've talked about them. They also shaped our Thought Leadership Series. So I want to break those down, some of those conversations that we had in the state roll call for you. So of course, there was lots of conversation around COVID response. Some interesting ideas. Some states were using affordable housing for emergency shelters. Lots of discussions around PPE and ventilators and stockpiling, and people had too many ventilators, but then all of a sudden they didn't have too many ventilators. And what do you do and how do you manage that in your new role? A key takeaway there was the uncertainty around the federal vaccine strategy, which this was in October. Now it's a lot more clear, obviously, and its impacts to states and what our roles would be in rolling out the vaccines, how some consultants have helped us in managing the COVID response, whether that was from procurement or accounting or warehousing and distribution. We also talked about several chief administrators manage state properties, and we talked about that. And what does that return to work look like? COVID and pivoting majority of your workforce to work from home, and we know employees like to work from home. So what is coming back to work maybe in the winter of this year look like? What does this mean for our space management? What does it mean for the property that we own? What does this mean for the property that we're leasing? How do we develop thoughtful master plans with our vendor partners on where do we house employees? Some key takeaways here were on funding, replacement and maintenance costs, dedicated inspectors to work on planning, and how do we use commercially, what is the best way for states to use commercially leased real estate? So lots of very different strategies here. Some states getting rid of properties, some states buying properties, but we all could use a little bit of help. This is one of the things that makes this year so interesting in the roll call, was that a lot of themes emerged that were very consistent across lots of states. And because we manage different things, that isn't always the case, but certainly this is one of those themes that rose to the top for many of us. Similarly is that future of work. What does it mean from an employee perspective? Where do they work? How do they work? What does it look like to have a remote workforce? Will you have a remote workforce that's just in your state? Will you expand beyond your state borders? How do we incorporate good telehealth practice or telework practices, including mental health? How do we support our teams? How do we safely return them to work? How do we measure productivity in this new remote environment? Whether or not you're a teleworker continues to bubble up for chief administrators. And then lots of conversation around diversity, equity, and inclusion, both in human capital management as well as in procurement. Well, several states are doing disparity studies. Several states are rolling out procurement plans. Key takeaways on the DEI planning from an HR perspective are, obviously there are very big differences between states, both in our composition around equity, diversity, inclusion, and also our strategies around equity, diversity, inclusion. But I think it's safe to say that every state wants all of our employees and customers to feel that they belong and they are included in our decision-making and our processes. Around supplier diversity and disparity studies, looking at what are those legal paths forward. As those of you know, we can't put in a solution around disparity in procurement without first identifying the problem. Some states have limitations on their quotas, so how do they plan for that? How do you break down the study to really look at what are your problems, and then what are your best practices to address those problems? Lots of IT concerns around rolling out new systems. Several states this year have rolled out new HRIS systems, learning management systems, or are looking to roll out those systems. A couple states were looking to do more e-procurement, and one state was looking to centralize IT. There's always this fluctuation in IT. Do we centralize IT, or do we have a dispersed model? Will the agencies manage IT? And the states are always swinging between these pendulum, or swinging between those 2 points. Around fleet management, a little bit in the area of what kind of fleet do we need if 40% of your employees are working from home? Do we let them take cars home? All of the policy around that, as well as the environmental issues around managing a fleet and the transition to electric vehicles or alternative fleet vehicles. We talked a little bit about financing for fleets. So there's 50 states, we do this 50 different ways. Some people get direct funding, some people get funding from the agencies, some people get paid for per use. So we're all over the board on that. But some key takeaways on fleet management were that obviously we have very different ways that we manage the state fleet. Particularly, there's concern around now that there could be less of a use for state fleet vehicles, and what do we do around that? And how do we measure that? How do we think through what is the right number of fleet vehicles that we have, particularly when we have so many workers working remotely? And even if they're only working remotely 30% of their time, it still affects our fleet numbers. And then kind of in the other bucket, there was some discussions around centralizing HR. Sustainability, how do we do better sustainability across all agencies? Customer experience and customer service-driven practices. So how do we always keep our customer at the forefront of our minds as we develop new policies and procedures and processes? Lots of conversation, obviously, I think this goes without saying, on the budget. What did both in the short term as a result of the pandemic, but also in the long term, we know that state governments are very slow to come out of recessions. So what does that mean for us? What does that mean for the goals that we have? What does that mean for our ability to deliver services and change the way government serves its customers? And then some conversation around leading through uncertain times. I think we're all up to here on resiliency. I think we've gotten lots of resiliency hands-on training, but that was certainly a discussion. So those conversations are influencing our top 10. And the other thing that greatly influenced our top 10, and thank you to our sponsors, was our Winter Thought Leadership Series. So as you know, we had many of our sponsors sprinkled throughout the Thought Leadership Series. For example, our learning labs on driving savings through agile real estate and facility strategy, our learning lab on managing labor complexities in corrections, and in our small group discussions around worker reentry and space planning, productivity, digitization of services, and equity, or diversity, equity, and inclusion in procurement, and action steps that you can use to start right now. So lots of great learning happened at the Thought Leadership Series, and I wanted to thank our vendors for bringing your expertise and really moving us all forward during that time. So those conversations, some polling we've done, the roll call, the Thought Leadership Series, all kind of helped. And Pam talked about a long process, and maybe in this crazy year, this long process was good because our priorities 10 months ago would not be our priorities today necessarily, or they would have shifted and differed. So with that, we wanted to give you an exclusive sneak peek at our top 10 priorities for state chief administrators. With that, I will turn things over to Jason Jackson from Nebraska and Brian DeForest from Oregon. They are our chair and vice chair of our research and policy committee. But first, a few words from Jamie Rogers.
Yeah, thank you so much, Carmen. As you are getting ready to hear, lots of those trends are echoed and made it into our top 10. We took the roll call, we took private sector interviews, we took the learning labs, we took really the last 2 months with the committee led by Jason Jackson and Brian to develop what are the priorities looking into 2021. So not so much where we've been, but where are we going? What are going to be the industry trends? And so Kayla, if you will pull up, we're going to go through these top 10. This will be launched in about 2 weeks. And then I'm going to ask Jason and Brian their perspective of what this actually means in the states. And just real quick, what we're going to do, we're going to go over this, and then we're leaving time at the end for you guys to talk about your perspectives as well as the industry and what questions you have for Jason and Brian, what this means looking into 2021. So we will definitely be calling on you here shortly. All right, next up. So the first, and this year we also did something a little bit different. These are not ranked by priority order. So in the past, we may have said, this is our #1 priority of chief administrators. This year, because this was collected qualitatively over interviews, over roll call, over surveys, we were confident in saying this is the top 10 priorities, but not confident saying one was over the other. So I do want to make that known. So we're reading these in alphabetical order. So the first one that is not a surprise to anyone on this call was budget reductions and cost efficiencies. This, as our state members are probably in the middle of budget processes right now, this is probably something that they will echo what 2022 is going to, fiscal 2022 is going to look like. But also looking at our peer association, NASBO, in 2021, they did some really interesting research on what states did and what they're doing to, Kayla, if you'll go to the next slide real quick, the actual levers that states used to manage budget shortfalls. And so this is from a NASBO recent survey. Targeted cuts out into 2021. So this year was the most popular method used for budget shortfalls. One thing that NASBO also noted was they saw a lot more targeted cut this year than across the board cuts in last fiscal year, just given more time to actually evaluate where cuts were coming versus strict across the board cuts we need to make and manage the cash flow fast. What was also interesting is this 2021, this is also ongoing. At the time that they took this survey, they had 19 states that eliminated vacant positions or did a hiring freeze, as well as the other most popular was using one-time fund transfers or rainy day funds. So that was also a popular method among states, is these one-time funds to fill budget gaps. And then you see fewer states doing across the board cuts and furloughs. What was also interesting, if you talk about budget shortfalls, though, 18 states did give raises to their employees, with 9 additional states giving merit raises. So it wasn't that every state gave furloughs, hiring freezes. So I want to note that. So if you go back up, Kayla, we're going to stick on this budget reductions, cost efficiencies, and I'm going to go to Jason to kind of walk us through, and also echoing what happened in Nebraska's budget is going to look very different what happened in California's budget or Florida's budget or West Virginia's budget. But you're in the midst of budget season right now. Sure. What does this look like? What does 2022 fiscal year look like?
Yeah, thank you, Jamie. And thank you all for being on the call. I'm Jason Jackson. I'm the Chief Administrator in Nebraska State Government, and I'm also Governor Ricketts' HR officer and the Policy Chair for NASCA. So it's our pleasure, and I'm sure Brian will introduce himself, but I'm joined by my colleague, Brian DeForest in Oregon, who's the Vice Chair of our committee. And so between the two of us, we'll tag team these priorities and really just try to give a high level tee up of, what was on the minds of our administrators as we identified these as the top 10, while reserving as much time as possible for discussion, which is where I think we want to spend the preponderance of our time. But to Pam's point and Kara's point, you heard Kara kind of enumerate the breadth of what is in our portfolio. And so it was a bit of a challenge to narrow it down to 10 things, but these 10 represent a synthesis, I think, of what's foremost on the mind of our administrators across the country. Beginning with budget. So, the uncertainty around COVID. I'll also briefly say what you'll see as we go through these top 10, some things endure and are challenges in any year. Other things are obviously most germane or top of mind because of the events surrounding of the past calendar year. I think budget is always on the forefront of the minds of our administrators, but the events of last year make that even more challenging, just given the fiscal uncertainty that are confronting states right now. And for administrators and the peers and the states represented by NASCA, similar to industry, when there's budget pressure, it's often back office business processes that are at the forefront of where people look for savings. And so I think our administrative officers across the country are meeting that challenge head on with an expectation of needing to be proactive in supporting their governors and their administrations and identifying opportunities for savings in those back office processes that can mitigate impact to our constituent services. For us in Nebraska, I suspect we're a bit of an outlier in as much as while we anticipated and prepared for a budget challenge, we haven't experienced it. Our fiscal health is actually very strong. And as a consequence, we aren't looking at a budget cuts coming into this budget. Our legislature just convened yesterday, and they're about to go through what's their long session, where they set the budget for the next biennium, and the governor's budget proposal will not include general budget cuts. As with any budget, there will be trade-offs within it, but there isn't any generalizable budget cut. We had entered the cycle here in Nebraska with preparing for contingencies to include a 2% and basically a 5% across the board contingency, and basically an ask of executive leaders in state government to bring forward proposals that would meet that contingency. But fortunately for us, the need for that hasn't arisen. But that doesn't change. We keep our eye on the ball because we want to help taxpayers wherever we can and be as efficient as possible wherever possible. One of the areas of opportunity that we're seeing in Nebraska is to reduce our real estate footprint and provide savings there, as well as reducing our headcount footprint, though we don't anticipate furloughs or layoffs or anything like that being necessary for the time being. And I think there's opportunity for us to talk about workforce strategy and real estate strategy later in the program. So I'll save the detail on that, but that's top of mind for me. Brian, anything you want to add on this one?
I think that, from an economic standpoint, the year has just been incredibly difficult to project. And so we prepared for 25% reductions, and what we're looking at in our governor's recommended budget is essentially a 2% reduction with some very targeted investments. And we're looking to our central agency to flex and bend and stretch so that our program agencies can continue to deliver the programs at the highest level possible. So it's been a unique budget cycle for us. I've been a budgeteer now for 30 years. I've never seen anything like this. My CFO is pulling his hair out because he can't project what's going to happen either. So we're really looking at how do we strengthen the core of state government, because we know that this isn't the last time we're going to go through anything like this. It may be another 30 or 50 years from now, but we need to be prepared to just adapt on the fly. And so it's going to be a unique set of investments and something that we've never seen before. I think homelessness, houselessness will dominate a lot of our conversation. And so we're looking for some very creative solutions in that arena.
Well, that is the state perspective. And we will go to the next one, customer service and customer experience. Not to say that there was a winner of COVID, but this was definitely something that we heard that the pandemic really forced major changes in the way to service other industries, whether this was providing digital services internally or whether this was providing digital services externally to the citizens. There were a lot of platforms that were implemented that helped chief administrators provide good customer experience to the other agencies that they assist with. And so customer service and experience remains high, but we also want to talk about both internally with the way that they operate with other agencies, as well as the trust and confidence that they had with other agencies, really having to build more trust and have more trust as things were moving rapidly. So Brian, I'm going to let you handle this one. What does this look like in Oregon?
Well, I think what you'll find is a lot of the top 10 will kind of collate and be driven through this concept of customer experience. I've been an advocate for how Disney provides services to its customers through its multiple platforms, through the in-person experience at the theme parks and whatnot. And I will never be able to get my administrators and managers to go through the Disney program because just because of the optics of it. But you look at a private sector company like that where they're selling an experience, and we've never thought about that in that way with state government before. We are selling an experience when you're renewing your license, whether that's an online presence or now with COVID, really thinking about how do we flex our office hours? How do we flex our staffing levels beyond the Monday through Friday 8 to 5? Because an entire workforce is going to change its set of work hours. There's no longer a single acceptable standard. There are now multiple standards. How does government adapt to that? Also thinking about the safety and security of the data that's flowing through from the kitchen counter, if you will, to the office environment itself. And this will flow into the next conversation, which is data and data trust as well. We think about the events of yesterday and building the confidence in government and changing that customer experience so that the customer can actually feel the transparency and the honesty and the integrity of that data as it comes through. Again, falling back into what's going on in Oregon, we're pushing for why does government have to be 8 to 5? Child Protective Services is a 24/7 operation. And why do we have to have our caseworkers just on that Monday through Friday, 8 to 5? Can we think about how we're going to staff people inside of an office? This also flows out to how we're going to purchase fleet vehicles, how many vehicles, swapping those vehicles in and out, just a whole plethora of different things. And then finally, as we move to that more remote environment, states like Oregon or Nebraska, or especially on the West Coast where you've got such large land masses to cover, how can I employ somebody that's 300 miles away from the state capital and get that very individual geographic presence through remote work Can I build trust in that way as well? I've got a city that's 350 miles away in Lakeview. And if I can put a procurement agent out there that can work with the local suppliers, the dynamics change completely, because they don't trust Salem at all, but they might trust their neighbor down the road who works for state government. So we're trying to think as far outside the box as possible, to the point where there is no more box, and how can we change that experience with folks. Overlying all of this, and you'll hear this theme over and over, especially in Oregon, is diversity, equity, and inclusion. It's great to have these ideas, but if the customer doesn't have access to government, it means nothing. If I'm not reaching the most vulnerable populations, it means nothing. If I'm not serving with some sense of equity, then it means nothing. And so you'll hear that theme pop up over and over in every one of these topics as we move along.
You can never find the mute button quick enough. And then I also know, Jason, that customer experience is something that you're really, really passionate about in Nebraska. So if you have anything on that before we go to the next one.
You know, and maybe just two brief comments. One would be, and Brian hit upon it a little bit, but you know, our customers bring their consumer expectations when they encounter government. And so increasingly there's a divide there. And if we don't pay attention to it, we leave people behind, as Brian said. The other thing I would just, earlier in my career, when I was in the private sector, I was with an organization that implemented self-service HR. And we applauded the fact that we had a system that made an HR generalist save them, you know, a transaction went from 15 minutes to 5 minutes. And we applauded how efficient that made us. Even though what we really did was just change the task and put it on the manager's plate, and it took them 45 minutes because they only do it twice a year. And I think that's the kind of thing that chief administrators in our states across the country, in all the facets of our operation, we face those tensions, is making sure that as we're implementing change, we have a mind on who is the true end user and the customer, and making sure that we're solving for their experience as we're designing designing those processes and implementing those changes.
Excellent. And then Brian already teased this one a little bit, so we don't have to spend a ton of time here, but data management and analytics. So as more things came online, how did those systems talk to each other? How did the HHS platform talk to social services? And so that data management, data analytics, the ownership of that data, making that data share, platform integration. Brian, will you speak to that one before we go to the next one?
I'd love to. In Oregon, we're experiencing a couple of different dynamics, so two different views. One is the life cycle of the data as it follows the individual through various government services. When a person is born, a record is created in our Department of Health. They move up through the K-12 system and through the education legacy systems, and then perhaps there's also a component of socioeconomic issues, and so they enter our healthcare system or other types of welfare, traditional welfare type systems. An individual may also enter our youth corrections, which then is on the radar of our state police, and into adult corrections, judicial system, and so on. A person ages out, and you kind of get the idea that the life cycle of the data around the individual moves from one state agency to the next state agency. Conversely, you have replacement of many enterprise systems across all of our states. Some states moved from mainframe into an ERP model. In Oregon, we're moving into a post-ERP model, which is really a glorified way of saying best of breed. Now, how do we take the life cycle of a person's data into a post-ERP environment where the data can flow, it's exchanged? I don't know what the definition of exchange means necessarily, but it's exchanged from one system to the next, one agency to the next. It's protected, there's high security, there's integrity. Where appropriate, there's transparency. Where appropriate, there's ultra high levels of security. And how do we manage all of that as we integrate all of that into a new online customer experience. So it's multifaceted. Um, Back to Jason's point of, do you centralize your IT? Do you decentralize IT? All of those conversations are taking place. I know in Oregon specific, we just replaced our HR system. We're moving forward with payroll timekeeping. We've integrated in a new procurement system, and then within the next 2 years, we're going to start talking about replacing our financials. And all of these things need to be flowing together in a much more sustainable environment going forward. Our systems are far more complex than they used to be, contain far more sensitive data than they used to, and yet they need to be as robust and secure as the traditional mainframe systems. So that's kind of my 2 cents on data, which is a really, really big deal.
Yeah, thank you so much. And as you can see, a lot of these are very interwoven. Kayla, if you'll bring back up, the next one was digital government, automation, and augmentation. And so this was both the internal processes, very connected to the customer experience that we've already talked about, of how helping agencies have HR platforms, finance platforms, procurement platforms, having that customer experience, as well as digital services for the citizen. And so this is both, we ended up combining this, both the internal processes, digital government, as well as some of the external processes. And we are at about halfway through, so I want to make sure we get through all of them. So we'll keep this one kind of short, just so that we can get on to some of the questions from our vendors. But Brian, if you'll do this one, and then we're going to have Jason and Brian tackle the next one.
Yeah, I kind of included a lot of this into the last summary as well. And you're looking at, again, the DEI and the accessibility of all of the data and the ability to push out services in multiple platforms that can be accessible by all. The public is also really pushing the envelope when it comes to dashboards and transparency of government as well. And I think COVID did us a favor on this one and really pushed us to the point we went online with a lot of our services within a 14-day time period. And now it's all about how can we continue to push that kind of progress out there rather than taking the traditional 2, 3, 4 years to roll systems out. DEI becomes especially important for our inner city populations with this digital transformation as well, as how can I include more and more of the public into our conversations and into our solutions.
So the next one was the diversity, equity, and inclusion in procurement. This is the first time this has made it to our top priority list. But when we heard from states, we heard that this also encompasses regionally helping. I'll look through my notes here. You'll see states making this a priority, evaluating their policies and barriers, and how easy is it to do business with the government. Looking at making contracts smaller, looking at the insurance and liability requirements, as well as subcontracting. And I know Jason kind of speak to this in Nebraska, looking at what does this mean to have more procurements available around the state to small businesses, to different regions. And then we'll also kind of hear what this means in Oregon from Brian next.
Yeah, sounds good. Thanks, Jamie. Team, I'll give the sponsors an opportunity to kind of step inside the tent at NASCA a little bit. As an organization, I think we're very sensitive to the fact that our states are very diverse. We represent states with wildly different demographic makeup. We have states with wildly different politics. But I'm optimistic that generally speaking, we all share the same values, even if different tactics might be where we pursue to try to get there in the end. So I think between Brian, myself, and Kara, we're pretty well represented here on the call today in this respect. When we looked at the events of last summer and all the conversation that sparked about diversity and inclusion in government operations, what that meant for our procurement operations in Nebraska was really a fresh look at, are there barriers to doing business with the government that we're not aware of? And are there things we can just do administratively to make government more accessible and more inclusive and invite more people to participate in government contracting? And so to that end, just within the past couple of weeks, we've launched what we're calling a procurement concierge program, whereby any prospective vendor who wants help with an RFP for state government can call one of our procurement operators and will literally be walked through the process. What we're sensitive to, or what our hypothesis is that there's unnecessary complexity. The process can be intimidating, and that if we can demystify the process, we can make it more inclusive and invite more people to participate and bid upon government contracts. The other piece of that is around transparency. We think there's probably an information gap in terms of suppliers and contractors that may not be aware of the services that government is bidding upon. And so we're going to get more transparent in terms of not only posting those contracts that we already have, but also, and those that are currently up for bid, but also prospectively, what services do we expect to bid on over the next 6 months, so that small business, minority-owned business, and rural businesses can all have an opportunity to anticipate and participate in those types of opportunities. So those are some of the initiatives that are top of mind for us in this space. Brian, I'll kick it over to you for Oregon's perspective.
Yeah, we have a little bit of the same thing going on, especially the concierge type service. It was a little startling to us as we were out there looking along with all of the other states for some PPE providers. And a couple of our providers in Oregon popped up onto our radar, and they'd been there all along, and we didn't know about them. And they helped us discover some of the barriers to our procurement process. And we were able to help them out, and they were able to help us out. Also along the line, we learned that sometimes national vendors provide great high-level services, quick access to product, especially in bulk and whatnot. But sometimes what's really needed is that frontline provider, manufacturer, service provider, or whatever, that can be nimble enough to really tailor the service at the local level. And we can reach them now, or are increasing our ability to reach them much more quickly. I live in a state that's 250 miles tall and 400 miles wide. And yet 80% of my population lives along the Willamette River, within 20 miles of the Willamette River. So it's a very narrow valley. If you think about it on a large scale, it's about the size of Israel, and that's it. But a lot of my providers are now coming from the eastern part of the state, the southern part of the state. We now have an entire generation where work from home is going to be the normal. And how do we increase our ability to tap into that expertise, those boutique manufacturers that can change on a dime and don't take a long time to modify their operations? And how do we do a better job of listening to the local company that has international ties that we didn't even realize they had? We got the majority of our PPE through those kinds of connections, and those connections were very ad hoc. It was very spur of the moment, and was simply a person that said, "Hey, I talked to this guy about 5 years ago. Maybe he's still doing the same business." I don't want to rely on that kind of communication for future emergencies. So rather than just run it by chance, let's develop those lines of communications and make them more solid on a go-forward basis.
Great, thanks to both of you. So let's roll through the other 5 that we have on our top 10. Kayla, if you'll come back to our slide there. Thank you. So we've heard a lot about diversity, equity, and inclusion. We talked a little bit about how that is critical in procurement, but it's also important in workforce, really what that implicit bias and conscious bias, how we take both an internal and external look at DEI, looking at our demographics, the whole talent management approach. Jason, you want to share a little bit about how you all are approaching this? And I know Cara had to drop off. I hate we didn't get in with her. She's doing a lot of work around this, but Jason, I'll turn over to you first.
For just from a talent management perspective, Pam?
Let's start there. Yes.
Yeah, so, a couple of things that are top of mind for us in Nebraska is just really strategic talent management. I think government is in a habit of just replacing like for like, rather than thinking about what does the workforce look like in 2025? What does it look like in 2030? And particularly when we think about the challenges of the past year, which really foisted upon government a need for greater agility than government generally has in terms of how do we scale up and scale down to meet different demands. For example, unemployment processing, contact tracing, and public health. There was a lot of challenges from just a human capital management perspective that I think was foreign in many respects, and perhaps not foreign to industry, but atypical of government operations. So those are some of the things that we're looking at in Nebraska, and I think administrators are generally looking at is how do you develop more flexibility? How do you replicate what industry has in terms of being able to scale up and scale down? And how do you build over time for a workforce of the future, imagining what you're going to need, not just tomorrow, but in 5 years' time?
Great. Thank you so much. And we do want to kind of package some of these a little bit because there's a lot here around human capital, talent, but especially kind of that umbrella of DEI. Brad, and I don't want to leave this before we talk with you. I know your governor has been very, very deliberate about ensuring that DEI is embedded and infused in everything that you all do. You want to share a little bit about that?
Yeah, our governor is very unapologetic that this is her top priority. Her budget went through a group of people that she put together to ensure that DEI isn't just a target, but rather it is part of the culture of decision making in the state of Oregon. That it flows through all of our priorities and we're always touching base. So she put together a racial council to vet every one of her investment initiatives going into her budget. We also look at DEI as an economic opportunity for different geographic regions of the state and populations that we can't reach. We may be looking at closing a prison or 2 or 3, and they are all located in remote parts of the state. It's very, very expensive to operate those prisons because you have to ship everything out there. And we could be looking at laying off hundreds of people. Well, how do we re-employ them back into state government and essentially maintain the economy of these remote cities? And can't a more diverse geographic workforce help with that? We look at the different levels or different categories of equity and inclusion, and how can we recruit populations that we've never recruited from before. We now have employees of state of Oregon that live in Louisiana and Mississippi, and we're no longer requiring them to relocate into the state of Oregon, because they already have that established support system where they are. They simply bring their expertise to our virtual table. Obviously, there's some of our employees that cannot work remotely, but wherever possible, we're opening up and expanding that idea. And that way we can have much more diverse conversations and decision-making, much more informed decision-making as part of that process.
That's very helpful. Thanks, Brian. So just to quickly talk a little bit about these last 2 on this slide, we know how critically important, especially in 2020 and moving into 2021, employee engagement and the employee experience are to our states, really becoming that employer of choice, making sure our states are looked upon as those employers that we want to move to. The health and safety of our employees are critical. So state chiefs are going to be looking definitely at how they move forward with ensuring that not only are they health and safe, but also that culture within a remote workforce is still there. Strategic workforce planning continues to be a priority for all of our states. We've already heard that there are going to be some reductions in headcounts. How do we really craft and create this enterprise-wide vision? So, Kay, let's go to our last 2 from our top 10. And we see here supply chain and stockpile management. We certainly did not think a year ago that PPE would be one of our priorities on where do we keep those, how do we keep those. You may have seen some comments back and forth on Collaborate just this week already around ensuring that PPE and what does that look like within states, where does that live and where does that land. Management along with the customer service along with that. And then finally, workspaces and space optimization, looking at our facilities and those pieces that go along with that, the green space, and continuing to talk about our lease space. Let me do a 30-second bounce back and forth between Brian and Jason on this, and then I want to hear from our sponsors on the call. So Jason, let's start with you.
I'll just say there was no area of our business that was more disrupted than these two categories in terms of being, operating outside of our tip. I mean, PPE was straight Wild West stuff, back in February and March and even into the summer months. So, we had to flex and develop entire distribution and logistics chains that hadn't existed, cultivate supplier bases that hadn't existed. Really quite a challenge, and we expect that challenge to continue to endure. And likewise from workspace. I mean, we proved out in an unexpected way just through business continuity that we can do remote and virtual and flexible work styling to a greater extent than we ever imagined, which I think is forcing every state across the country to evaluate what is their true commercial real estate needs. So just two very disruptive aspects of our business that I think many states are still in discovery mode upon what this looks like.
Brian?
Can you put the slide back up? I'm sorry. Go ahead, please, Brian.
Our experience, very much the same thing. We spun up a 100,000 square foot warehouse in 7 days, and we were distributing PPE by the end of that week, and not something that we'd planned on doing. We stumbled into an opportunity to buy a warehouse that we were going to convert into laboratory space, and we got lucky in Oregon, and we know that. And so we're already now in the planning stage on how do we convert that into a long-term solution to go ahead and create our laboratory space, but also diversify our warehouse space across our geography. Same thing with how do we reduce our leased footprint without damaging local economies. Those investors in some of those outlying cities bank on government to pay those leases, and how do we make that sort of transition? And again, with the stockpile management, we have a little bit of expertise, but what can we learn from other states? How can we help other states? We had one state in particular that's just desperate for stockpile management services, and we have a little bit from our perspective, but there are some states that are going to start from scratch where others are a little bit more mature. And on the reducing lease space, some of the more radical ideas take it down by 80%, especially for our smaller agencies, whereas others are actually looking to create a little bit more leased space again out in some of those outlying areas. For us, the very southern portions of Oregon actually need more space, and we have no idea where the real estate market is going. It's very confused. It's at the residential level, it's very much a seller's market, but what's really happening at the commercial level, and how can how can state government be a good player in that game?
Yeah, all very, very helpful. Well, I think just from hearing our conversation today, there are a ton of different things that we can walk away with, our takeaways. I think if we had this conversation, 11 months ago, we probably would have been heading into a very, very different realm and direction. So 2020 has certainly shaped us into new atmospheres of this conversation. But I do want to hear from our sponsors and our corporate partners that are on here. What were your biggest takeaways? What were some of the things that perhaps were shocking? Anything new? And then let me just also open up that opportunity for questions of our state folks that are on the call with us today. Now, you all remember I'm pretty good at calling on people, so.
Well, I thought
I'm
it was
happy
a very
happy to-
informed list, and you guys did a great job of both putting it together and discussing it. I mean, on that last slide, I think somewhere in there, saying out of where we started going really fast on procurement in order to accomplish the supply chain, which of those changes do we retain? Because a lot of things were we went fast, and did that mean stuff broke? or should we keep some of those concepts? I think that'll be a question that'll be on the table for you guys, right? Like, you know, which maybe hasn't shown its face yet. And then the second one, you know, it may be kind of too small, but I think the concept of teaching our staff about what the change of space means, like things like hosteling, not hostile, but hosteling, right? Like, you know, that you come in and, you know, you rent or you sign up for a space. Like if you, like when I was doing a project with Ernst & Young earlier in the year, their whole space is all hosteled, everything, right? And you say where you're going to work on a day, and it's a huge culture shift. So that connection between a sense of place and a sense of work, I think, is a really interesting part of that second one. So, but you know, the list is great and y'all did a good job on it. So thank you for sharing it with us.
Thanks, Dustin. And I think
So Dustin, you bring up,
Go ahead, Brian.
oh, Dustin, one thing that strikes me is the change in the supply chain. We had such a heavy reliance on just in time. And it's obviously the most efficient way, and in the commercial side, it's the most profitable way to do business. But what did just in time in a supply chain do for us, and how does government modify that so that we have flexibility in the production lines? And what's the role? What's the partnership look like between private and public?
Yeah, exactly. Nina, I saw you had that you went unmuted there for just a moment. Something you'd like to share?
Yeah, just on the people side of things, one observation is, gosh, there's been a lot of stepping into big leadership roles across the board in very unexpected ways. And I'm sure, you know, we saw that obviously in the private sector, but I imagine in the public sector as well, asking your team to step into big roles in unfamiliar territory, in changing conditions that we could never imagine. And that will continue. And asking of yourselves to step into big leadership roles and doing things that perhaps you didn't imagine doing in the ways that you needed to accomplish them on behalf of all the people of the state that you serve. And so coming out of that, right, there's this, I think, need for continued leadership development to sustain that and to grow that and to really create next generation leaders that are ready for whatever life throws at us. And so I just hope that we can find ways to celebrate that and find ways to embed that in the culture of how we work, because there are so many people that can be celebrated that have stepped up and done amazing things and learned a lot. And so let's keep doing that.
I don't think any of us could agree with you more on that point. How about others on the call? Thoughts?
Nina, to your point, CAOs across all of the states went from an average of about 2 initiatives that they would be involved with to somewhere over 10 initiatives this year.
Incredible.
Year alone. My personal, she was involved in. And to your point about people stepping into leadership roles, some of my instruction to my staff were just run with it. And then allowing the trust to happen, and all of the investments that I made into staff just flourish and blossom, and watched it grow. It was a very incredible year for that.
Thank you, Brian.
Other thoughts, takeaways, or comments?
Yeah, hi, I'm Brian. First time.
Hey, Brian.
No, I thought it was very cool how you guys are increasing access to like RFPs and helping with the RFP process and procurement. Like Procurated, the company I work for, is building like a Yelp for government, like, you know, finding ratings and reviews for suppliers as government officials. So it's cool to hear that you guys are helping smaller businesses, diverse businesses in this way. And, you know, we're trying to help out also by providing some list and way for you to find those types of businesses. So that's great.
Thanks, Brian, and welcome. Glad to have you. All right, we've got a few more minutes here. Anyone else on the call would like to make a comment or ask a question of Jason or Brian?
I'd just be, sorry, Blake Kingston here from Evaluate. Curious, I look at the list and obviously number one, well, I know it's not order, but just the first one that was talked about was the budget reductions and cost efficiencies. And then all the things that follow tend to be, investment areas. And a lot of them are obviously, customer centric or, citizen centric. So just wondering how has the evaluation criteria, I guess, changed for you when you're looking at investing in different solutions when it comes to being citizen centric?
I mean, I'll jump in and then invite Brian to follow me up real quick. As I look at this list, I think one analogy, it's like air, food, and water. We need all three. You can't live without one of them, and everything on this list, I think, is a similar thing. What's more is if we look at, for Nebraska, as I, work through that list and how it's applied here, it's an and, not an or. And what's more is almost everything on that list, we can move the needle without new money. I referenced, the procurement program that Brian spoke to just a moment ago. That doesn't require new money. That's just us taking a customer-centric view of how we're doing things and redesigning our process, spending a little bit of time to make our website a little more accessible and visible, and then shifting around our time investment equation so that we're focusing it on the customer. So that's kind of how I look at it. It doesn't necessarily require money to do these things. And if not, let's dedicate the energy and just our creative potential towards that.
I agree that you're talking about a relatively low amount of financial investment, because sometimes we just have to stop and think, us as government, we're very good at telling, we're very good at talking, and we're very good at providing, but we're not very good at listening. And much of what we need to emphasize is just listen to your customer and try to find the root cause or try to find the root solution that we need to pursue. A customer's going to come up and said, this is what I want. This is what I want. Great. Tell me more. Expand on that. Tell me a little bit about of what's going on. What does the environment look on? And then fill the need rather than just the want. But it all starts with listening. And this is where I threw out the reference to Walt Disney companies before. You go to a Disney park, they anticipate your needs. They don't just anticipate your wants. They'll sell you all you want, but they anticipate your needs first. And that's where government needs to hedge towards. And it takes training. It doesn't take a lot of investment.
Great. Well, I have just a moment after 3 o'clock. I want to thank both Jason and Brian for giving us your time. Thank you to Cara, who had to drop off. They have some issues going on in Colorado, so she couldn't stay with us. But thanks to all three of you. Thanks to Jamie and Kayla for pulling this together for us today. And again, thanks to our sponsors for sticking with us through the Summer Thought Leadership Series and the Winter Thought Leadership Series. 3 more dates coming up in January. So we want you to dial in, tune in for those, and then we'll be off to the races unpacking these top 10 starting off in February. So thanks so much for joining us. We'll talk to everybody soon. Have a good rest of your afternoon.